Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. We're so happy that so many of you have joined us today from around the country and across the Atlantic. My name is Kani Mutipalas and I'm with the Embassy of Greece. Today's program is a collaboration between the Embassy and the UCLA Stavros Niarchos Foundation Center for the Study of Hellenic Culture. And we are very happy to have joined with the center for this event. As you know, under the direction of Dr. Sharon Gerstel, the center produces outstanding programs. This program is in honor of Black History Month and highlights the actions of Photius Fisk, an orphan of the Greek War of Independence who wanted to make the world a better place. Please note that after the lecture, Dr. Gallant will entertain questions and we ask that you enter them into the chat box. Also, out of courtesy for our speaker, as well as your fellow listeners, please set your microphones on mute. Before I introduce Dr. Gallant, however, I would like to welcome Her Excellency, the Ambassador of Greece to the United States, Alexander Papadopoulou, to make an opening statement. Ambassador.
Thank you, Connie. Dr. Gallant, Dr. Gerstel, dear friends, thank you for being with us here today. It is heartwarming indeed to know that so many of you, as has already been stated out, not only the United States but also from other countries are watching this program. This is the silver lining of current circumstances. While the virus has limited us in so many ways, it has opened up new horizons and has prompted us to reinvent the wheel, allowing us to connect with audiences around the world. Today, I'm especially excited since we will share with you a page from Greek American history. We will learn about a story that has its beginnings during the Greek War of Independence. As you all know, we celebrate the bicentennial of the Greek War of Independence this year. Greek American history stretches back more than 200 years and is made up of stories as diverse as the American demographic landscape. Inspiring stories that span the scope of human activities. And as with all immigrants, these stories are part of American history. They're stories that changed the American face, they're stories that inspired America, they're stories that helped America become what it is. All these stories invariably involve courageous immigrants who took a leap of faith and crossed the Atlantic in search of a better life for themselves and for their families. The Photius Fisk story especially resonated with me when I read about it, and I have to admit that I read about it rather recently. I find it truly inspiring, and I'm looking forward to hear Dr. Gallant's presentation, which will shed light on this fascinating person, his fascinating times, and the effect of his actions on history. We look forward to sharing many other such stories with you in the future, and we hope that you will join us. Hopefully, sooner than later, we will be able to host some of these events in person so that I will have the opportunity to meet you and learn your own stories. Thank you.
Dr. Thomas Gallant holds the Nicholas Family Endowed Chair in Modern Greek History and is Professor of History and Archeology in the History Department and the Center of Hellenic Studies at the University of California in San Diego. He received his PhD in classical archaeology from Cambridge University and has been professor at universities in the US and Canada. He's the author of 12 books and over 50 articles. Among his most recent books are Modern Greece from Independence to the Present, Harvesting the Gifts of the Sea, Aegean Societies and Marine Life, and Νεωτέρη Ελλάδα από τον πόλεμο της ανεξαρτησίας μέχρι τις μέρες μας. Forthcoming are Murder on Black Mountain, Love and Death on a 19th Century Greek Island, and Europe's First Modern War, the 1897 Greek-Ottoman War. He was the inaugural director of the Center for Hellenic Studies at University of California, San Diego, and continues to direct the vibrant PhD program in modern Greek history. Dr. Gallant has also served on the executive board of the Modern Greek Studies Association in numerous capacities, including president. He was the editor of the Journal of Modern Greek Studies from 2015 to 2019, and is currently the editor-in-chief of the 10-volume Edinburgh History of the Greeks and the Routledge Handbook of Modern Greek History. Dr. Gallant, we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Connie. It's quite appropriate that we end Black History Month by talking about a figure who, even though he played a prominent role, is really somewhat forgotten in the story. Let me begin with a poem. This is a stanza from one of the most famous abolitionist poems of the time. And it reads as follows: 1,000 hearts their energy shall lend. Now Garrison urges like cause to defend. Now Phillips raises humanity to bliss. And Photius Fisk shall lead to bright success. Garrison here is, of course, the most famous abolitionist, William Lloyd Garrison. And in the next breath is the other most famous abolitionist, Wendell Phillips. Mentioned in the same breath as these monumental figures of the abolition movement stands Fisk. And indeed, according to the poem, he is the one that will bring it to success. So who was this man who was mentioned in the same breath as these abolitionists? Well, what I want to do today is to introduce you to his story. And I'll talk at the end about why it matters. But let me just foreshadow that by saying that Fisk stood throughout the 19th century at the crossroads of almost all of the major progressive liberal movements in America of the 19th century. But his focus was not just America, as you will see. His view was one that encompassed all humanity. So let me begin with his story. There we go. Who was Photius Fisk? Well, the story begins at Edinburgh, where he was born probably around 1806, best we know. He had family on his maternal line in Edinburgh, and his relatives remained there. We know that his family moved while he was still an infant because he has no recollection of life on Edinburgh. His earliest memories came from Smyrna. So I'm figuring somewhere around 1808, 1809, the family moved to Smyrna, where they joined the family business. He was born into a middle-class family of merchants. And in Smyrna, his father became a clerk in the family merchant business. Fisk remembers as a youth harvesting figs in the field, and he had nothing but fond memories of his early life on Smyrna, but that all changed very quickly. The 18 teens was a turbulent time in the Mediterranean. Not only was it a seat of war, constant conflict, but it was also a time of privation and hardship. From 1807 to 1820, there was a major economic depression that had a severe economic impact, leading to, in some areas, even famine. In addition to that, through the 18 teens, plague swirled across the Eastern Mediterranean, and it hit Smyrna particularly virulently in 1814. And he lost all of his family. His mother, his father, his two sisters, and his two brothers all succumbed to the disease, leaving him with only one immediate blood relative, his brother, who was living with his maternal uncle on Malta. Fisk was also stricken with the disease and had a difficult recovery in one of the poorhouse hospitals. Upon his recovery, he was sent to Malta to live with his uncle. So he arrives there in 1815, and he has nothing but fond memories of his Malta days. He recalls playing in the streets with other Greek kids. He had cousins, and in the little neighborhood where they lived, he had nothing but, again, memories of his time there. He proved himself to be a very bright child, but also one who was extremely difficult. And so his uncle decided that he needed to be educated. And so, noticing that the child was particularly bright, he enrolled them in the Jesuit college with one proviso, that he was not to receive any religious instruction in Catholicism and be able to keep his Orthodox faith. This was agreed to, and so he entered the Jesuit college, where his life would change forever. In 1822, the Reverend Pliny Fisk, along with a colleague, arrived in Malta. They had been sent by the American Board of Commissioners of Foreign Missions, which we usually abbreviate to ABCFM. So this was a Congregationalist organization who, beginning in the 1820s, was sending missions all around the world to both bring education, conversion, but also they embarked on sending children from around the world to be educated in the Congregationalist schools in New England. Fisk was on his way to set up the missions in Alexandria and Beirut after he left Malta. While there, however, he visited the Jesuit school, and he encountered Fisk along with one other very bright lad named Anastasios Karavelis. And Fisk decided that these two lads were perfect for an education in America. And so he contacted a Captain Dewar, who was the captain of the brig America, and he made an arrangement whereby the two boys would be conveyed to Massachusetts, where the captain would be reimbursed for his expenses, and the boys then would be sent to the Cornwall School. So in October 1822, on their own, the two boys set sail for Salem. They arrived in February 22nd, 1823. Upon their arrival in Salem, they received a great welcome. They then were taken on a tour of all of the Congregationalist missions across New England. They were brought to, I would say, introduced to more people what the mission of the ABCFM was. And so they were brought from place to place. And in each place, the New England Protestants, wringed their hands and poo-pooed about these poor, ignorant immigrants who could not even speak English or communicate. In fact, one person referred to them as being treated like a couple of young baboons in a zoo, being trotted from place to place. The irony was that the good New Englanders could not communicate with the two children in English, but if they had switched to either any of Italian, Greek, Maltese, or Arabic, then they would have had a very good conversation with these boys who were 12 and 9. The boys were then sent to the Cornwall School. The Cornwall School was established by the Foreign Mission, by the ABCFM, to be the first point of entry for students into the system. There, Photius and Thanasis met students from around the world. The majority of students at the school were Native Americans, but there were also Chinese, Hindu, Hawaiian, Syrian, Chilean. Students from around the world were at the Cornwall School. The Cornwall School's primary goal was to teach the students English and prepare them for the next level of education. And I should note, so I won't have to repeat it, that at every single level, Fisk excelled in the academic setting. So from the Cornwall School, which you see here, where he was from 1822 to 1823, from there he was enrolled in the Hopkins Academy in New Haven. While at Hopkins, he was there for 2 years, preparing him for entry to one of the liberal colleges. While at Hopkins, he and Thanasis split. Upon their finishing the courses at Hopkins, Fisk was to be enrolled at Amherst College, where Thanasis stayed in New Haven, where he would eventually obtain a law degree before returning to Greece. We'll meet him again in our story. So from the Hopkins School then, he was admitted to the prestigious Amherst College. And his freshman and sophomore years, he excelled in the classroom, but less so out of it. He proved to be a very difficult young man. And at the beginning of his third year, He decided to, rather than go to classes, he decided to skip off with a classmate to go to this fellow's family's farm in Vermont to go horseback riding. Upon returning to Amherst, he was expelled, as this was his fourth offense for being absent from campus without permission. And so he was thrown out of Amherst College. You can see here. Now, eventually, you'll see this gap before you get here. Eventually, he will become a student at the Auburn Theological Seminary. But that gets us a little ahead of our story. What happened when he was ejected from Amherst College? Well, the ABCFM was, of course, most perturbed at this development. And so, as a penance, they required him to do the following. They were in the midst of putting together a massive relief package that was going to be sent to Greece. And because, of course, his fluency, he was sent to be the assistant to the captain on the ship, who was Captain Bates. And so he set off in this fall, in 1827, upon the USS Statesman. They arrived in Malta in October, and while resident at Malta, the Battle of Navarino took place. And here you see Navarino here. Here you see a scene of destitute family in a cave in Greece for whom this aid was earmarked. So the Battle of Navarino takes place. The Battle of Navarino, as you know, is the deciding battle in the War of Independence. And it turns the tide completely, because after this war, it was a foregone conclusion that there would be an independent Greece of some sort. Caught up in the enthusiasm that followed the post-Navarino victory, he abandoned ship, broke with the board, went to Greece, to Navarino, in fact, where he attempted to join the Russian Navy. For reasons that are unknown. They didn't want him, so he joined the Greek Navy, and he was commissioned to the frigate Hellenic. However, life aboard a Greek warship was not actually to his taking, and so he went AWOL. He made his way to Smyrna when he got on an American merchant ship that was crossing the Atlantic. In the Caribbean, however, they ran into a storm, and the ship had to put to shore on Martinique. The ship's captain decided to continue the voyage, but not to North America, but to South. And so Fisk was stranded on Martinique, and he decided to stay and explore it. This was the first time he encountered chattel plantation slavery. And the scene you see here is of the famous slave market in Martinique, which he visited numerous times. And so this tapped into both what he saw as abhorrent, but also it tapped into his early life. When he was in Smyrna, there were slaves all around. Slaves worked in the fields. Slaves worked in the store. Families had servants who were in fact slaves. And so he had been familiar as a child with the concept, but it was really on Martinique that it brought home to him the horrors of chattel slavery. And this would change him forever and set his life's course. At this point, when he returns to New England, and then he moves to New York, where he enrolls in the Auburn Theological Seminary. And he will study at the seminary from 1831 to 1839, when he will be ordained as a Congregationalist pastor. And so from this point on, he is the Reverend Photius Fisk. Upon graduating from the seminary, he became chaplain of the Navy. You might ask, how on earth did he go from being a student to being a chaplain of the Navy? Well, the Auburn Theological Seminary had become one of the centers for abolitionist thought. It was producing new cohort after cohort of pastors who were were abolitionists. And so he became familiar with many of the leaders of the movement in the 1830s, and he himself became a fervent, ardent abolitionist. Let me tell you at this point a little bit about Fisk's temperament so you'll see how it shapes the rest of his life. Well, Fisk had a short fuse and a hair-trigger temper. According to one account, quote, he possessed a most violent and vindictive temper. The eyes that melt into tears at the sight of suffering snap with rage at whatever friend or foe ventures to cross one of his peculiar whims or offended any of his singular notions. Close quote. He was a man who held his views passionately, but not necessarily strongly, as you'll see. But more than anything else, he had a Manichaean view of the world. Quite literally, it was black and white. And so when he adopted a cause, he threw himself into it with a complete passion. But when he fell out of it, his adverse reaction was equally as strong. So, calling on the network of people that he became familiar with who were centered around the abolition movement, he became very close friends, and he had been since the 20s, with John Quincy Adams, whom he met when Adams was vice president. At this point in 1840, Adams is a representative in Congress, and so he pushes for Congress to approve an act to appoint Fisk to the rank of chaplain and captain in the USS Navy. The appointment is approved by President John Tyler. All the way up to the presidential level. Even more surprising part of that is the fact that at this point, and I'm still trying to find if there's any evidence or any of his letters about why, but he decides to change his name from Photius Cavasalis to officially Photius Fisk. And that is approved again by an act of Congress and then finalized by a presidential order. So for the rest of his life, then, he will be Photius Captain Photius Fisk, USN. And his first appointment is to the USS Columbia. The USS Columbia was one of the flagship ships of the US Navy, and it was to be sent on almost a world voyage. Over the span of 3 years, it would begin with a voyage along the coast, the eastern coast of South America, around into the Pacific, up the west coast of Chile, and then deep further into the Pacific around Hawaii, then back into the Atlantic, up the east coast of Africa, the west coast of Africa, and then ending in the Mediterranean. His time on ship was a particularly trying one, because in the USS Navy at the time, almost the entirety of the officer corps were drawn from men from the South, who were all either slave owners themselves or clearly pro-slavery, from the captain on down. And so Fisk, who again never shied from an argument, made no bones about his anti-slavery views, his abolitionist views, to the extent that none of the officers would berth with him. The officers banned him from the officers' mess, and he was essentially exorcised. And he knew this, quote, "I knew that my social ostracism was my penalty for holding anti-slavery views." And so he actually spent much of the voyage in the company of the crew, and he got to see life on ship from their perspective. And this will also be a life-shaping movement for him, and will lead him to his second passion after abolitionism, anti-flogging. The only part of the voyage that he really liked was that he got to visit so many lands. He became an avid collector wherever he went. So he collected objets d'art, he collected rock samples, he collected almost everything. So he had a very inquisitive mind. And so visiting these places was really a great treat for him. And he spoke, in his later years, he spoke with fond memories about this voyage, at least some parts of it. Well, while the Columbia was berthed in Naples, he got permission from the captain, who was only too happy to see him go, to go on shorely for 3 months to visit Greece. So in the the early winter of 1844 to the spring of 1845, he was in Greece. He immediately became connected and participated with the activities of fellow missionaries or fellow missionaries in Greece. In this case, the Reverend Jonas King, where they became fast friends. But he also became quite friendly with King Otto, whom he met at a royal reception, and the two hit it off. And over the time he was there, he met repeatedly with the king and became sort of an informal advisor, particularly on issues revolving the care of the poor. So this was his first time back since the war. And here again, he threw himself wholeheartedly into what was going on in Greece, which again was a crucial moment. This was when Greece was shifting from an absolutist monarchy to a constitutional monarchy. And so this was a very, very, very interesting time to be in Athens, to say the least. On his returning to America in 1845, he threw himself into his new passion, the anti-flogging movement. He wrote a pamphlet recounting what had happened, what he had seen on the Columbia, and he became extremely active. What he did, not he alone, but he working with others in the movement, they bridged, and in some ways even almost merged, the anti-flogging movement with abolition of slavery. So he saw, or at least activists saw, a way to further the abolitionist cause through the vehicle of anti-flogging in the Navy. His first move towards actually fulfilling this dream occurs in 1844, when one of his closest friends, a man named John Hale, is elected to his representative of New Hampshire. And in 44 and 45, working with the group, they introduced legislation to ban flogging, and both times they fail. Things change in 1848 when Hale becomes elected Senate. At the same time, Fisk leads a movement to send petitions to Congress about it. The biggest boost came, however, in March of 1850 with the publication of Herman Melville's famous novel, in which the horrors of flogging are laid out. And so now a bill introduced yet again by Hale, this time succeeded. October 28th, 1850, flogging in U.S. Navy is banned. As the Cincinnati Enquirer reported it, Fisk will forever be known as the man who stopped the disgraceful flogging of seamen in the American Navy. With one passion done, there was still his great life work, that he saw the abolition of slavery. However, the 50s were a bit of an interlude and the lowest point of his life. While the anti-flogging legislation was a landmark in progressive lawmaking in the 19th century, it also was deeply unpopular, both in the South and in other sectors of American society, and particularly in the military. The antebellum U.S. Armed Forces were dominated by Southerners. And so out of spite, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy got revenge on Fisk and ordered him to report as naval chaplain to the naval base in Pensacola, Florida, the deepest of the deep South. Here again, not only was Fisk persona non grata on the naval base, but even in the town as well. And at this point, he contemplated leaving the Navy, but he stayed it out. And in 1858, he was ordered to return to DC, where he would have probably the most monumental transition in his life. On his way back to Washington, he boarded a riverboat steamer to go up the Mississippi. While on ship, he met a Baptist minister who was also a wealthy plantation owner. And the two began to debate the biblical foundation or opposition to slavery. over a few drinks on ship, they decided that Fisk should come along with this man to visit his plantation, to actually see what a US plantation looked like. And they would continue their debate. The Baptist minister was so convincing that it shook Fisk's faith. He could not refute the argument that the Bible gave overwhelmingly strong support to the institution of slavery. And after much soul searching, he renounced his faith. If slavery is any part of Christianity, then I am not a Christian. From this point, he would be a free thinker, and he would become one of the leading free thinkers in the second half of the 19th century. So now, an atheist, which created, of course, all kinds of problems because most of his close friends were still very active members in the Congregationalist ministries. His conversion of faith came to a head with the Civil War. When the war broke out, Fisk was told to report to the USS Powhatan, a warship, and he refused because he said he simply could not, as a non-Christian, he could not minister to the spiritual needs of his men. And he captured the situation he was in. Yes, he said, I am in a bad predicament upon all sides. I cannot, without hypocrisy, perform the duties of a chaplain. Neither can I tender my resignation or ask for revocation of the order without laying my action open to unjust criticisms. Well, here again, calling on his political network, he got no less than Senator Charles Sumner, soon to be Lincoln's Secretary of War, to speak to the president himself. And it was actually arranged for Fisk to meet Lincoln. After which, Lincoln issued an executive order that awarded Fisk a leave of absence of full pay for the duration of his service, which was until 1864. At the end of the war in 1864, with his term up, he returns to civilian life. However, over the course of his naval career, he was able to accumulate a fortune. He was a very frugal man whose needs were very modest, and he invested very wisely in American bonds, and he made a fortune during the Civil War. To the extent that at its end, he had, and all of the dollar figures I will give you in the remainder of the talk, was $4 million, with which he purchased this huge farm in Franklin, Mass. This was a huge working farm, all the farm animals, it had gardens, it had fields, and he opened it up to one and all. Fisk's farm in Franklin became one of the hubs for post-Civil War abolitionist, now Reconstruction activities. Anyone could come. Poor, black, poor, rich, black, white, it didn't matter. Anyone could come to his table and be fed. In fact, he converted the barn into one huge dining hall for feeding people. And it's a who's who of American progressivism who passes through. Garrison, Phillips, Lucretia Mott, another one of the leading abolitionists, and even John Brown. In 1858, Brown spent over a month on the Fisk farm. From there, going south, and we all know how that will end at Harper's Ferry. So Fisk then, in the 1860s, becomes a very prominent figure in not just the abolitionist movement, which now is morphing into something else, but he is seen as one of the leaders of what we can call early American progressivism. In 1871, he makes his final trip to the homeland. He will spend 1871 to 1874 visiting Greece. He will now go on the classical tour, Delphi, etc. So he begins by going on the classical tour to see all of the ancient sites, and then he goes on a nostalgia tour. He goes to Amphipolis on Syros to meet with his old friend Thanasis, who had settled there opened a law practice, and had a family. He spends a month in bliss with his friends. Quote, their meeting was a joyous one to both, and after hearty greetings and expressions of delight, they found no lack of subjects interesting conversation. When Fisk left, Thanasis wrote to him, my dear Foti, remember me ever, as I will always remember you. If idolatry is a sin, I will commit that sin in remembering you always. I will love you sincerely to the end of my life. The two men who had spent much of their early years side by side would never meet again. So from Syros, he will go to Smyrna, Chios, Constantinople, ending at Hydra, where he will spend time with his relatives before returning to the US to see to his financial situation in the midst of the Depression. We have one of the documents we've been able to find is part of his re-entry form to get into the US. So this is when he's returning from Greece. It says that he's a citizen of the United States, was born in Greece, that his age is 62. They got that a little wrong. His stature is 5'3.5". His forehead, his eye. His eyes are hazel. His nose was, of course, Grecian. His mouth was small. His chin medium. His hair gray. His complexion dark, and his face thin. The rest of his life, he will live on number 3 Tremont Street in Boston. So the final 2 decades of his life, located right there. Here is Boston Common. Here is Tremont Street, Boylston Street, and this little lane right here is called Tremont Place, and it was number 3. This is the famous Tremont House, one of the most famous old hotels. Well, Fisk's rooms, he had 4 rooms, these 4, except on the opposite side of this building. He will live the rest of his life here in his apartments. Now, on the second story of this building was the headquarters of the American Women Suffrage Association, in which he would be a very active participant. So for the rest of his life then, he lives at Tremont Place, and he devotes it to basically giving away his fortune, which I'll talk more about in a second. So the final 2 decades then, he becomes a figure of Boston, a mainstay of almost all of the progressive movements, the women's movement, the women's rights movement, the anti-Greenback movement. And as you'll see in a minute, he will still be very active in affairs back in Greece. Fisk dies on October the 10th, 1890. Let me tell you about his will. I don't have the full of it yet. I just have a synopsis that I got from the archives, but I'm getting from probate court. I'll be getting all 6 versions of his wills. Here is the final one. His will is hotly contested, and it went to court. The Greek Council General represented Fisk's relatives from Hydra, and this was the final disposition of his will. His relatives in Greece won their suit, and they were awarded $10,000, which in today's currency would be $285,000. Fisk also had, or the estate also had to pay their court costs, which, as you can see, was almost another $150,000. The remainder of his estate, which at one point had amassed to almost $6 million, was down now to this. Of the remainder, he allocated $5,700 per month to go to the Colored Woman's Home in Boston. And then the remainder, almost $500,000, was to be placed into endowment to continue to fund the charities closest to his heart. Throughout his life, he had been an exceptionally generous man. No cause, no case of suffering went without his addressing it. Let's look at some of his charitable giving. He's best known for these. He paid for the monuments over the graves of some of the most prominent abolitionists of the 19th century. The one you see here, for which he paid over $8,000, was a sculpture over the tomb of Captain Jonathan Walker, who was interred in Muskegon, Michigan. Walker had been a very prominent figure in the 1840s, trying to run a sort of underground railroad from Florida to the Caribbean islands. and he was captured, and he was branded with SS, a slave stealer. And so at his death, to commemorate him, Fisk paid an enormous amount of money for this monument to be made. He paid even more for the gravestone, which is like the monument to one of his closest friends, and again, one of the leading suffragists, William S. Bailey. He's known then, and these are just a couple of the monuments that he erected. But more important, what I want to get is are the little tales, the small things he did that never get publicized, but that impacted people's lives. Let me just give you one. It's sometime in the late 1880s, and Fisk is having tea with Emma Willard, one of the leaders in the movement for women's education. And Willard tells him a story about a poor widowed seamstress living in a nearby town who slashed her hands so badly that she was unable to work, and that she and her 7-year-old daughter were on the verge of destitution. Without saying a word, Fisk immediately gave her the equivalent of $300, and then for every week until the woman was fully recovered, Fisk sent her $300, which at the time would have been an enormous sum of money. It's little stories like this that are replete in his life story. He also continued to support causes and institutions in Greece. From the 1860s onward, he sent on an annual basis monies to Greece to support his two favorite causes, the Athens poorhouse and the male orphanage asylum, which you see here. He sent, for example, in 1875, he donated $450,000 in today's currency. Just to give you a sense of what that meant, that was the wage of a skilled tradesman for 200 days. So we're talking a substantial amount of money. So by the time he ends then, as you saw, Fisk's estate was down to nothing because he had basically given it all away. So how do we understand Fisk and where do we contextualize him? Well, I want to argue that he's truly a transnational figure, or to put it in his words, he was a cosmopolitan. And this is a new project, so these are very preliminary claims that I'm making. But certainly, I want to claim that he stood at the intersection of these movements: Philhellenism, abolitionism, women's rights movement, and I could even add a couple more as well. Now, following on an argument by an historian in Santelli, who argued that the Philhellenism and the people who supported it in the 1820s starts to transform into or become incorporated and inform the abolitionist movement, the same people, the same tactics. And so Philhellenism will continue throughout the 19th century, but now it'll be closely associated with abolitionism and towards the end, even women's rights. And Fisk is one of the key players in this for two reasons. First, the practical one. He became, for so many progressive causes, he was the money man. But also, he stood as a sort of cipher in terms of intellectual discourse. The modern values of American society, liberalism, democracy, humanitarianism, which again, these progressives prized, these were values which, of course, they say they derived from ancient Greece. And so for them, people like Fisk were a living link in some ways to this past. And the fact that Fisk, as well as some other folks we'll talk about in a second, were so active in these causes, it sort of created this alliance with modern Greece, modern Greeks, to ancient Greece, to modern America, to again, this idea of cosmopolitan humanitarian that was emerging. And here you see again, part of his effort, he is supporting orphans in Greece itself. So one part of it then was this very practical, his almost linchpin role in all of these different movements. Secondly, I want to come to the issue of identity and contextualize them within Greek America. Throughout his life, he never severed his connections or even lost his love for his homeland. As you saw, he went back repeatedly. And in addition to he himself continuing to possess a Greek identity, although considering himself an American. it was also an identity that was placed on him. Here are some of excerpts from letters about him. He's always referred to, his Greek identity is always mentioned. He's called a Greek by birth, a proud member of the Grecian race, a flu-blooded Greek, etc., etc. And so to Anglo-America, his Greekness was a central part of it as well. And in conjunction with the activities of some of these other men. Now, believe me, I do not want to get into the hagiography or to in any way sustain the myth of the 40 war orphans. I mean, that was debunked a long time ago by Steve Frangos. What I want to emphasize is that these men were in contact with one another, that they espoused many of the same causes, that they formed, as it were, I don't want to say a community was too small, but they formed an intellectual cohort that elevated the presence of Greece in certainly progressive American thought to a level that was higher, that was quite high. And what I think needs to be explored further in this project is what happens in the aftermath, because almost all of this first generation of these people all pass away between mid-1880s and the mid-1890s, which of course is exactly the moment that the mass migration of immigrants from Greece to America begins. So what needs to further explanation is the connection between those two narratives. But let me leave you with just a few thoughts about him. Here again are some of I want to leave you with an understanding of how prominent he was. He was considered amidst the most foremost free thinkers of the age, a most noted abolitionist. You can read the paragraph yourself about how he became a fixture in Boston life, and I'll leave you with the last one. Photius Fisk. This is a letter written by a woman whom he helped with charity. Photius Fisk. His name ought to be written letters of light and beauty with a pen that is diamond-tipped. Well, as was noted above, this man is one of Boston characters known and loved by many, especially among the poor, lowly, and unfortunate. His name is Reverend Photius Fisk, and he has a strange history. I hope today to have given you at least a brief introduction to his strange story. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Tom, for this wonderful talk. First of all, let me introduce myself. I'm Sharon Gerstel, Director of the UCLA Stavros Niarchos Center. And I just want to thank the Embassy for their wonderful invitation to co-host this seminar. We always love to work with Ambassador Papadopoulou and with Connie and Murtupalas, and we couldn't be more honored to host this lecture of our amazing colleague, slightly to the south, Thomas Gallant, and I hope we will come back for a second lecture of his later in the spring. So we'll see lots of you this year. Yeah. The people in LA always think about the stories in terms of film, and I want you to know that several people have already said this would make for an amazing PBS series. I'm sure you have this very much in mind as a Southern Californian, how we could present this visually. So generating that kind of excitement and reaction, I think, tells you that you're onto an amazing story. I want to ask, since we're both historians, for you to talk about the sources of this detective work that you're doing. What are the sources in Greece? What are the sources in Massachusetts and elsewhere? It sounds like a very exciting journey.
Sure. Well, there is one biography of him by a very close associate who in fact was the executor of his final will. So we have a biography, and in the biography, Heyman collected letters and other materials to it. So we get that. Then there are newspaper sources. I've been looking at newspapers across the country. As you saw, according to the Cincinnati Enquirer, certainly in the Boston newspapers, he is spoken about repeatedly. There is a full-page spread about him in 1891 in the Boston Daily Globe. It's the second page of the Boston Daily Globe was an article about Fisk. So I'm looking at newspapers. Then, of course, there's all kinds of US government records, which I'm getting into. The acts of Congress are all there, as are the debates. So I have to look at those. The various acts, for example, presidential decrees. I don't know what's in the Tyler archives, but I will certainly be looking there. Duke has a collection of Fisk's letters. And so the way I'm approaching this is, it's not a Greek story. It's not a Greek American story. It's not an American story. It's a transnational story. And I hope to make contributions with it. So I'm approaching this very much as an American history, an American story that is contextualized in this broader frame, these broader frameworks through him. So I'm going to use him as a vehicle to talk about many of these issues, which US historians only approach from a US view. So what I want to do is sort of broaden that discourse to include these other voices, and again, to restore some of these, not just Fisk, but others as well, to place of prominence to, they've been excluded in ways I want to explore. So we've got all kinds of, now in Greece, of course, as soon I'm searching, I want to get into the foreign ministry archives, of course, see what's available. I'm going to check through some of the State Department records, the Department of Navy records. So there's a great deal of work to be done, and this is a preliminary foray into this project. Yeah.
It's so exciting. I think a lot of us probably listening were shocked to hear about his relationship with King Otho, and I wonder, how do you access those interactions? How do you reconstruct those interactions that they had?
It depends upon if a secretary was there. It's inscribed. There are archives obviously in GAC. I'm sorry, the Greek generals, the Greek State Archives, as well as the archives of the Parliament. I know the materials for the 1840s are voluminous, but I haven't been able to get access there. And I know that online are at least some of my students, one was living in Greece, so maybe he can do some quick searching for me while he's there. Hint, hint.
Related to, we have a bunch of questions coming in. Let me start with this one. Related to what I was just asking, is there any evidence Fisk had any role in the first Greek elections under the 1844 Constitution, and particularly Article 9 of that Constitution that explicitly bans the sale of human beings?
That's a great question. It would not surprise me. I mean, he is there at the time that debates are still going on. He's there before it's passed. If he himself was not a voice, this is what I want to look at, is what ways in which the discourse of American abolitionism influenced. But certainly he spoke. I don't know even the gist of their conversation. I just know that they spent considerable time together, and that particularly issues involving, again, the key social issues that drove Fisk high on the top of the list, of course, was abolition.
So related to that, pivoting back to the United States, was his farm in Franklin, Massachusetts, a stop on the Underground Railroad? And is there any information about interactions or collaborations with Frederick Douglass or Harriet Tubman or any other leaders of the abolitionist movement?
Absolutely. The Franklin farm was one of the key nodes in the Underground Railroad, and all of those people just mentioned graced his table.
Similarly, with his involvement with the suffragette movement, did he have close collaborations with any of the great leaders of that movement that we revere today?
Yes, he knew them all. In fact, the AWSA was actually founded in Boston. In fact, almost all of the suffragette organizations were founded in Boston. And they were many of the same people who had been involved in the abolitionist movement, who had been involved in the anti-flogging movement. So what we see is this continuity of people. Right? And so, yeah, so Fisk was very, very active in the suffragette movement. He knew them well. His apartment was above the headquarters. And when the two organizations merged, again, that takes place after his death, but he was very supportful of women's suffragette, which is, I don't want to say strange, because it tapped into his feeling about, fairness, but he also was a misogynist. I'll take just a second to explain this. After flogging and abolition, his other pet cause was marriage. He was a lifelong bachelor, and he abhorred marriage. He thought it was the worst institution ever created by man, and he railed against it to the point that just what can I do about this? He was contacted by, again, a friend of his vast network who told him about a Union captain, abolitionist, who had lost his fortune, was living in the South, had lost everything. Fisk sent him $1,000, which would, in today's currency, about $30,000 to help him out. Well, Fisk then finds out that the guy used the money to get married. Fisk writes the guy and demands back the money because Fisk said, there's no way I'm going to pay for you to get married. I demand my money back. So he had quite literally a love-hate relationship with women, but his unstinting feeling of fairness, right? So he became again, he wasn't the guy in the front. He was in front of the curtain. He was the one behind funding these organizations. He gave money to establish 4 suffragette newspapers. And so he was the one who, again, was providing the financial support for the suffragette movement.
Several people are thinking about his relationship with the church, which you articulated so well. Did he ever come back to the Christian faith, or what was his relationship with the Greek Orthodox Church?
He left the Greek Orthodox Church in the 1830s when he became Protestant. And after his loss of faith in 1858, no, he remained a free thinker. And in fact, it's a whole other branch of his life is the free thinker. We're focusing on abolition because we should, but he was also a major free thinker. Here again, not writing. He was not an intellectual. He was not a thinker. Right, but he supported the causes, and so he gave money to again to establish periodicals and newspapers for that cause as well. So that's how he saw his role. But he was also a very, very difficult person to get on with. But again, he's this linchpin in all of these different liberal progressive causes.
I was thinking his difficulty makes him a much more interesting figure to study. Other questions, something we're all wondering, how did he amass his fortune other than bonds? Were there other ways? Was his farm profitable, for example?
No, the farm was a disaster. It was a money pit. He sold it after 4 years because it was costing too much. He made, again, this is more work to be done, but particularly if I can get some of the documents from the Department of the Navy, but he the fortune while he was at sea, because captain's pay was quite generous. And since he basically was ostracized by the officers, his on-ship expenses were relatively modest. And so he was able to pack a good deal of money away, and he invested very wisely. In particular, he made a fortune during the Civil War, investing, manufacturing, and other areas. But he comes out of the Civil War an extremely wealthy man.
Our dear friends Cliff and Theo Arg, who live in Washington State, ask, what is the title of the biography? Of course, the biography before the biography you're going to write.
The one by Mr. Hyman. It's called Photius Fisk, a biography.
Very simple, very straightforward.
And the author is Lyman Hodge, Hodge.
One of our listeners suggests that Admiral James Stavridis would be very interested to learn about Photius Fisk. Have you been in touch with him to offer this?
No, I haven't, because this is, again, something very, very new, which I'm just starting to get into. So no, I have other projects that I have to see through to completion before I can come back to this one.
We'll, of course, share the very positive comments that are rolling in about this lecture, offers of people to help you with your research in Greece. Dimitrios Giannaris, we know he was young, but did he, again, about involvement in the 1821 Independence Declaration? Anything more about that you'd like to say?
No, in 1821, he was 15 years old. He was I don't want to say a street urchin, but he was he was a teenager playing around in the streets of Malta and going to school. So no, he has no no relation to 1821. The only connection is his elder brother, who was was part of the family on Malta. He leaves, he goes from Malta to Greece and joins the insurrection in the spring of 1822. When in fact, that's the time when most areas of Greece declare for the revolution. So his brother goes. What happens to his brother is uncertain. That's something I'm going to try to find out.
One question we have, or statement is, I'm an Afro-American male married to a Greek female. When Greeks immigrated to the USA, what influence did that have on Greeks coming to America? Do you want to say something about, did he have an influence? Were there influences in the 1950s of movements of Greeks coming to the US? Could you say something about, maybe even given the timing of this lecture, relations of Greeks and African Americans in this country?
I meant to type 1850s.
Okay, you're making me work here. So what influence did he have on Greeks coming to the United States from his trips to Greece?
That is a great question. Well, it seemed to me a two-part question. And sort of what role did he play in his lifetime? Did he do anything to facilitate emigration from Greece to the US, like sponsoring people, etc.? At this point in my researches, I have found no evidence of that he supported that. His impact on the civil rights movement, particularly involvement of the Greek American community in the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, I think this is not a topic that I'm well versed in. Yorgos Anagnosou would be really the person to address that one, and Simeos, of course, because we had a great workshop on this topic, and there are connections, but at the moment I don't know of any references or back referencing that brings in Fisk or what he stood for. Maybe Yorgos or others do, but I am not aware of that.
What was the spark? What was the moment that got you involved in this story? What was your entry point to this story?
Well, what I tend to do when I work is, as I come across stuff that interests me, I sort of I sort of file and put it away. And this was one that the stories of the Greeks, the early Greeks in New England resonate with me because that's where I'm from. I'm a Greek American family from New Hampshire, Nashville, New Hampshire. Hale was our senator. So growing up in a Greek American community in New England, I was interested in the subject even from high school on, after I got rid of much of what I learned in Greek school. So I was interested in that because I felt the connection, not to him specifically, I don't know much about, but to what was going on in New England, what had been, in fact, the heritage that of the American side, as it were, that I was interested in. So over the years, when I came across references and stuff, I would start accumulating. So I had a pretty sizable portfolio that I put together over the years. And then when this opportunity came, it provided me with the opportunity to try to bring the story together, even in the preliminary form that I presented it today.
Related to, there's a very interesting question. Has he ever been recognized by an American or a Greek American, or I would say even a Greek organization, or even by the Greek government for his amazing contributions?
No.
Peter Korbakis, writing from Chicago, asked, did he have any connections with other Greeks in the US at the time? What do we know about his Greek network?
Oh, I'm sorry. I missed it. One of the last slides I presented showed you that. Yes, yes, indeed. He was very much connected to with almost all of the most prominent of these individuals. John Sakos, for example, one of the leading educators, a man who played a critical role in introducing education for freed slaves, or in fact, during the Civil War, teaching slaves literacy, etc. He became one of America's leading educators, and he lived in Boston. And he and Fisk were fast friends, bitter enemies, fast friends, bitter enemies. Zakos's network was always in flux because he was such a contrarian. But no, he was deeply embedded in the network of these prominent people had migrated from Greece.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think we have time for a few more questions, just a few. And Connie reminds me about his orchid collection. Can you say something about his orchids for those of us in flowers?
I do not. That I do not. Connie will know more about that than I. No, I don't know about the orchids. I'm not.
Circle back for an appendix to the volume with the.
Yeah.
Lydias, do you know anything about his thoughts on the monarchy in Greece being, let's say, a foreign monarchy? Did he have thoughts about that?
Not that I've come across so far. All that I've got from that, until I can get into the Greek archives, which hopefully will be the summer, little is known about that visit. I have some of the highlights, and particularly when I know more about what was going on the Protestant side, because there's some correspondence with Jonas King and with King going back to the ABCFM. What I do know is just one, I only have one source that mentions, it said that Otho and Fisk met at a royal reception, and that they hit it off, and he was invited back for a personal audience. And from there, it blossomed into, in a relatively short period of time, a very cordial relationship. And they met apparently on a number of occasions. But what was said, all that, and the context of it, I have to get into the Greek archives, and hopefully there'll be some materials that at least will give me some better sense of what he was doing.
And there's a question about what publication will emerge, but again, you've emphasized how early this is in your research, and I think even people who are listening today may be writing to you afterwards with little Fisk stories that they have.
Ah, yes.
And that would be really wonderful to get those stories for you.
Yeah. What I was thinking is, while I'm working on the project, to publicize it, make this really much a crowdsourcing project, is I would like to do a sort of a more popular article or more magazine type of article than an academic one. I'm not prepared to write an academic article that I will put before my colleagues for peer review with what I have now. But I believe that I have sufficient evidentiary basis to write a general article giving the broad contours of his life, very much following along what I produced today. That I'm confident about, but the academic one, no.
And
too early.
Encourage the filmmakers that were here, I see their presence, to get in touch with you to think about developing a project about this information here, which would be great for students. Really excited.
There it is.
Absolutely. And again, one of my main emphases is going to be to tell this as an American narrative. Right? How he, as an individual and through his network, shaped some of the contours of American history in those crucial decades before and after the Civil War.
Well, I think we've been treated to a wonderful lecture this morning. I think people are so excited about the material. I can't wait to hear more about it. I know you're going to be developing this in a series of lectures, and I probably will follow them to see how your thoughts are developing through the year, but it's such an exciting project and has so many angles that are of enormous interest. I really want to thank you for spending the morning with us. I'd like to thank the ambassador for the invitation to co-present this lecture, and Connie, thank you so much for the wonderful introduction this morning, and Ellen for all your technical assistance. But Tom, as always, you challenge us to think in different ways, and we are so lucky to have you in Southern California to inspire us and all of us. So we look forward to your next lecture with us, but I hope everyone has a great Saturday afternoon, and we should all stay healthy and be able to convene to hear the final story in person.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure.
Thank you everyone for being with us today. Thank you so much.